March 17, 1944. A cold morning at Camp Hereford, Texas. Sergeant Giuseppe Romano stood with his arms crossed, watching the American guards post a new work assignment notice on the barracks bulletin board. Around him, dozens of Italian prisoners of war gathered, their faces etched with the weariness of men who had traveled across an ocean in chains, surrendered their dignity along with their weapons, and now faced an uncertain future in a foreign land they had been taught to fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. The notice announced that selected prisoners would be assigned to local industrial facilities to support the American war effort. Romano couldn't help but smirk as he read the vague description, industrial support. He knew what that meant. Backbreaking labor in ammunition plants, perhaps, or grueling shifts in steel foundries. The Americans would work them until their bodies gave out, just as his own officers had done to conquered peoples across North Africa and the Mediterranean. This was the way of war, the price of defeat. He had accepted it the moment British forces captured his artillery unit outside Tobruk 18 months ago. Corporal Matteo Ferrara, standing beside Romano, spat into the dust. Another factory assignment. They will work us like mules and feed us like rats. Do you remember what Benedetti said about the munitions plant in Pennsylvania? 12-hour shifts, dangerous chemicals, barely enough food to keep a man standing. This is how they treat prisoners while they speak of Geneva Conventions and humanitarian principles. Romano nodded slowly. The rumors had spread through the POW camp network like wildfire. Italian prisoners assigned to American industrial facilities reported harsh conditions, exhausting labor, and treatment that bordered on exploitation. The Americans maintained a facade of civility, but beneath the surface, they were no different from any other conquerors. They would extract every ounce of useful work from their captives before discarding them. Private Antonio Bianchi, younger than the others and still carrying the idealism that combat hadn't entirely crushed, leaned in to read the notice more carefully. It says the facility produces essential supplies for both military and civilian distribution. They need workers who can handle precision tasks and maintain production quotas. The pay is posted as standard POW labor compensation, and they mention that housing and meals will be provided according to international standards. Ferrara laughed bitterly. International standards. That means stale bread and watery soup. Essential supplies probably means bullets and bombs. They dress it up with pleasant words, but we know what American industry does. It feeds their war machine while their propaganda tells the world they are liberators and heroes. Over the following days, camp administrators conducted interviews to select prisoners for the industrial assignment. Romano found himself called before Captain William Harrison, the liaison officer responsible for POW labor coordination. The American sat behind a simple desk in a sparse office, reviewing a file that Romano assumed contained his military record, capture report, and behavior assessments from the past 18 months. Sergeant Romano, Captain Harrison began, without preamble, his Italian accented but functional. Your record indicates you served as an artillery logistics coordinator before your capture. You managed supply distribution, inventory control, and coordination between multiple units. Is this accurate? Romano straightened slightly. Yes, sir.
I oversaw ammunition distribution and supply chain management for the 132nd Artillery Regiment. Before the war, I worked in my family's shipping business in Genoa. I understand inventory systems and production logistics. Harrison made a note in the file. The facility we are assigning you to requires workers who can follow precise protocols, maintain quality standards, and work efficiently within structured production environments. Your background suggests you possess these capabilities. You will be transported to the facility tomorrow morning along with 40 other selected prisoners. You will receive a full briefing upon arrival. Romano wanted to ask what type of facility, what kind of production, what they would actually be manufacturing. But he had learned during his months in captivity that prisoners who asked too many questions received unwanted attention from guards who viewed curiosity as potential subterfuge. He simply nodded and returned to his barracks to prepare for transfer. That evening, the selected prisoners gathered in quiet clusters, sharing cigarettes and speculation about their assignment. The consensus was uniformly pessimistic. They were being sent to manufacture weapons that would be used against their former comrades, or perhaps to produce the very bombs that would fall on Italian cities. The irony was cruel, but it was the reality of their situation. They were defeated men in a defeated nation, and the victors would use them however they saw fit. Ferrara voiced what many were thinking. We should refuse. Tell them we will not work in their death factories. Make them respect the conventions that say prisoners cannot be forced to produce weapons. Romano shook his head. And then what? They court-martial us for refusing orders? Put us in isolation? Reduce our rations further? We are prisoners, Matteo. We have no leverage and no options. We do what they tell us, and we survive until this war ends and we can return to whatever remains of our homes. The transportation trucks arrived at dawn. 40 Italian prisoners climbed into the canvas-covered vehicles with their meager possessions and the resignation of men who expected nothing good from the journey ahead. The trucks rolled out of Camp Hereford, heading northeast through the flat Texas landscape. Romano watched through the gap in the canvas as the countryside passed by, noting the vast empty spaces, the occasional farmhouse, the sense of a land that had never known the devastation of modern warfare. After several hours, the convoy turned onto a side road and approached what appeared to be a large industrial complex surrounded by chain-link fencing. Guard towers stood at intervals along the perimeter, and American soldiers manned the main gate with the same stern efficiency Romano had observed at the POW camp. But something seemed different about this facility. The buildings were painted in bright colors rather than military drab. The grounds were landscaped with grass and flowering plants. There was no smoke, no industrial grime, none of the visual markers Romano associated with weapons manufacturing or heavy industry. The trucks passed through the security checkpoint and stopped in front of a large brick building with windows that actually let in natural light. An American officer, a major judging by his insignia, stood waiting with several civilian managers dressed in white coats that suggested laboratory or medical work rather than factory supervision. Major Robert Patterson stepped forward as the prisoners disembarked. "Gentlemen, welcome to the Sweetwater Production Facility. I am Major Patterson, and I oversee operations coordination between military logistics and civilian production at this site."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. You have been selected to work here because this facility requires workers who can maintain high-quality standards and follow precise production protocols. You will receive training over the next 3 days, after which you will be assigned to specific production lines based on your aptitudes and the facility's needs. Romano exchanged glances with Ferrara. Sweetwater Production Facility. The name meant nothing, revealed nothing. It could be a code designation for anything from chemical weapons to aircraft components. The Major's emphasis on quality standards and precision suggested something technical, possibly dangerous. Patterson continued, "Before we begin orientation, I want to address what I am certain are your concerns and assumptions. You have been told, I am sure, that American industrial facilities exploit prisoner labor for weapons production. You believe you will be manufacturing ammunition, explosives, or other implements of war. I want to be clear with you from the outset about what this facility actually produces." He paused, and Romano tensed, preparing himself for whatever revelation was coming. This facility manufactures confectionery products. Specifically, we produce chocolate bars, hard candies, chewing gum, and various other sweet goods for distribution to American military forces and, increasingly, for civilian consumption under government contract. You gentlemen are going to be making candy. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. 40 Italian prisoners stood frozen, trying to process what they had just been told. Candy. Not bullets, not bombs, not poison gas or incendiary devices. Candy. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that for several long seconds no one moved or spoke. Finally, Ferrara found his voice. Candy? You brought us here to make candy? Patterson nodded calmly. That is correct, Corporal. This facility is one of several confectionery production plants operating under military contract to supply American forces with morale-supporting provisions. Chocolate and candy are considered essential supplies for maintaining troop morale and providing quick energy in field conditions. We also fulfill contracts for domestic civilian consumption as part of maintaining home front morale and economic stability. Romano felt his carefully constructed expectations crumbling. He had prepared himself psychologically for brutal labor, for moral compromise, for the grinding degradation of being forced to contribute to a war machine he no longer believed in. He had steeled himself to endure whatever the Americans demanded with the stoic acceptance of a defeated soldier. And now, they were telling him he would be making chocolate bars. The orientation began immediately after Patterson's announcement. The Italian prisoners were led into a conference room where they were provided with translated documentation explaining the facility's operations, safety protocols, and production standards. Romano read through the materials with growing disbelief. The documents described a sophisticated manufacturing operation that produced millions of individual candy units per month, all destined for military PX systems, field rations, and civilian distribution through government-controlled allocation programs. The facility employed over 300 workers in total, a mix of American civilians, military personnel assigned to logistics and security roles, and now prisoner labor to address wartime manpower shortages. The prisoners would work standard 8-hour shifts with meal breaks, receive the standard POW labor compensation, and be housed in barracks adjacent to the facility that were described as meeting or exceeding Geneva Convention standards for prisoner accommodations. What struck Romano most forcefully was the tone of the documentation.
There was no propaganda, no attempt to portray the work as punishment or exploitation. The materials treated the prisoners as workers who would be trained in specific industrial processes and expected to maintain professional standards. It was almost respectful, a perspective Romano had not encountered in his months of captivity. The first day of actual training began early the next morning. The prisoners were divided into groups of 8 and assigned to different production areas for hands-on instruction. Romano's group was led by a civilian supervisor named Charles Morrison, a middle-aged man with the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades training new workers in industrial processes. Morrison began by showing them the raw material storage area, vast rooms filled with sacks of sugar, cocoa powder, milk solids, corn syrup, and various flavoring compounds. The sheer quantity of ingredients was staggering. In Italy, these materials had become impossible luxuries by 1942, available only to the wealthy and connected. Here, they were stacked floor to ceiling in quantities that represented more sugar than Romano's entire village would have consumed in a year before the war. Ferrara stared at the inventory with undisguised shock. This much sugar? For candy? While people across Europe are starving? Morrison nodded acknowledgement of the implicit criticism. I understand how this must appear to you, but I want you to understand something about American industrial capacity. This facility represents a tiny fraction of American food production. The United States produces such enormous agricultural and industrial output that we can maintain civilian consumption, supply our military forces, provide lend-lease materials to our allies, and still have surplus capacity. What you see here does not come at the expense of more critical resources. It exists alongside them. He led them into the production floor, a vast space filled with gleaming stainless steel equipment, conveyor systems, mixing vats, molding machines, and cooling tunnels. The entire operation was spotlessly clean, well-lit, and organized with an efficiency that reminded Romano of photographs he had seen of automobile assembly lines. American workers in white uniforms and hairnets moved through their tasks with practiced precision, monitoring gauges, adjusting flows, and performing quality checks. This is Chocolate Line 3,
Morrison explained. This line produces approximately 40,000 individual chocolate bars per 8-hour shift. The process begins with the mixing of cocoa powder, sugar, milk solids, and cocoa butter in precise ratios determined by our formulation chemists. The mixture is heated, refined, and tempered to achieve the proper texture and melting characteristics. It is then molded, cooled, and wrapped in individual foil and paper packaging before being packed into shipping crates for distribution. He walked them through each station, explaining the purpose and operation of every piece of equipment. The level of mechanization was extraordinary. Where Romano had expected heavy manual labor, he found instead that workers primarily monitored automated systems, performed quality inspections, and handled materials transfer between production stages. The machines did the heavy work, while humans ensured everything operated within specifications. At the wrapping station, an American woman named Dorothy, who appeared to be in her 40s, demonstrated the quality control process. Each wrapped bar is inspected for proper seal integrity, correct weight, and packaging defects. Bars that do not meet standards are removed from the line and the chocolate is recycled back into the production process. Our rejection rate runs about 2%, which is considered excellent in confectionery manufacturing. Romano found himself asking technical questions almost despite himself. How do you maintain temperature control during the tempering process? What is your typical production variance across a full day's output? How do you handle ingredient quality variation between different supplier batches? Dorothy smiled at his engagement. You have production management experience.
I can tell by the questions you ask. The tempering is controlled by a closed-loop water circulation system with thermostatic regulation accurate to within half a degree. Production variance is monitored hourly, and we adjust mixing parameters if we see drift beyond acceptable ranges. Ingredient quality is addressed through rigid supplier specifications and incoming inspection protocols. We reject supplier batches that do not meet our standards, which keeps them honest about quality control on their end. He learned that Sweetwater was one of dozens of similar facilities across the United States, all operating under military contract to supply candy to American forces worldwide. The entire American confectionery industry had been partially mobilized for war production, but unlike munitions or aircraft, candy manufacturing required relatively modest retooling and could continue serving civilian markets while also supporting military needs. The facility manager, a civilian named Robert Thornton, who had worked in confectionery production for over 20 years, took time to explain the strategic importance of candy in military logistics during one of their coordination meetings. Sergeant Romano, I know this work must seem trivial compared to artillery logistics or combat operations, but I want you to understand why the military considers confectionery production essential rather than frivolous. Thornton pulled out production data and military consumption reports. A typical American soldier in a combat zone consumes between 2 and 4 ounces of chocolate or candy per day, provided through field rations and PX supplies. This is not luxury. Chocolate provides concentrated calories and quick energy in a portable, shelf-stable form that requires no preparation. In winter conditions or during extended operations where hot food is unavailable, chocolate can mean the difference between maintaining combat effectiveness and succumbing to exhaustion or cold. He showed Romano photographs of soldiers in various theaters opening chocolate bars. But beyond nutrition, there is morale. Men under stress need small pleasures that remind them of home and normalcy. A chocolate bar represents a moment of comfort in conditions of constant danger and deprivation. Military studies have consistently shown that morale items like candy contribute significantly to combat effectiveness and psychological resilience. Romano studied the data with professional interest. In the Italian army, such considerations had been largely absent. Soldiers received basic rations designed purely for caloric sustenance, with little thought given to morale or psychological factors. The idea that an army would allocate industrial capacity and logistics resources to ensure its soldiers had candy seemed almost decadent. Yet the data suggested that this apparent decadence translated into tangible military advantages.
As weeks turned into months, Romano's understanding of American industrial capabilities expanded beyond the confectionery facility to encompass broader patterns of production and distribution. Through conversations with supervisors, observations of the supply chain, and access to production data, he began to perceive the systematic nature of American material advantages over Axis powers. The Sweetwater facility received raw materials from dozens of suppliers across multiple states, all coordinated through logistics networks that functioned with remarkable reliability despite wartime transportation constraints. Sugar came from refineries in Louisiana and California. Cocoa arrived from processing plants that handled imports from South American sources. Milk powder was supplied by dairy processing facilities in Wisconsin and New York. Every ingredient met strict specifications, arrived on predictable schedules, and came in quantities that never seemed to run short. Romano compared this to his experience managing artillery supplies in North Africa, where ammunition shortages were constant, fuel supplies unpredictable, and spare parts often unavailable for months at a time. The Italian military had operated in a condition of permanent scarcity, forced to ration and substitute and improvise because the industrial base could not maintain adequate supply flows. Yet here was an American candy factory receiving better logistic support than Italian frontline combat units had enjoyed. The true revelation came during Romano's fourth week at the Sweetwater facility, when he was granted access to the production planning office to help coordinate an upcoming shift in manufacturing priorities. The office contained detailed charts showing not just the Sweetwater output, but aggregate production data from the entire American confectionery industry operating under military contract. The numbers were staggering beyond comprehension. American candy factories were producing over 500 million pounds of chocolate annually, even during wartime rationing. Hard candy production exceeded 300 million pounds per year. Chewing gum output topped 200 million pounds. These figures represented only military contracted production and did not include the substantial civilian market that continued to operate despite wartime constraints. The total confectionery output of the United States during the war years exceeded the entire industrial production of many smaller nations. Romano sat at the desk studying these figures with the analytical mind of someone trained in logistics and supply chain management. He began making calculations, comparing what he knew of Italian industrial capacity against what these documents revealed about American production. The comparison was not merely unfavorable, it was devastating. The United States was producing more candy, a non-essential, luxury item, than Italy had produced steel in the years before the war.
A single product category in American light industry exceeded the total heavy industrial output of an entire European nation. Morrison found him still reviewing the documents hours later, long after the shift change. The older supervisor pulled up a chair and sat down beside the Italian sergeant. "You are beginning to understand, I think. Not just about candy production, but about what it represents." Romano looked up from the papers. "How is this possible? Italy is an industrial nation. We build ships, automobiles, aircraft. We have factories that operated for decades before this war. Yet you produce more of a trivial product than we produced of critical war materials. This should not be mathematically possible unless everything we believed about comparative industrial capacity was fundamentally wrong." Morrison nodded slowly. "You are touching on something that military intelligence analysts and economic planners have struggled to explain to political leaders for years. American industrial capacity does not follow the patterns that European nations expect, because it developed under completely different conditions and constraints. We have advantages that are not obvious from outside observation." He pulled out a map of the United States and began marking locations. Sweetwater receives sugar from Louisiana, which has massive refining capacity built over a century of agricultural development. Our cocoa comes through ports that can handle more tonnage in a month than most European ports manage in a year.
Our milk powder suppliers in Wisconsin operate dairy processing facilities larger than entire Italian food production districts. Every input to our candy production chain benefits from infrastructure and scale that accumulated over generations of continental expansion and industrial growth. But it goes deeper than infrastructure, Morrison continued. American industry operates with excess capacity built into every system. We overbuild deliberately because our market economy rewards companies that can scale production rapidly to meet demand changes. When war came, we did not need to construct new industrial capacity from scratch. We simply redirected existing overcapacity toward military production while maintaining substantial civilian output. A European planner would see this as wasteful redundancy. We see it as strategic flexibility. Romano absorbed this explanation, fitting it into patterns he had observed over his months at the facility. The abundance was not accidental or recent. It was systematic and deeply embedded in how American industry had developed. The Sweetwater facility itself was 15 years old, built during peacetime to serve civilian markets. The equipment, the processes, the supply chains had all been established long before the war. Military contracts had simply added additional production targets to existing capabilities without requiring fundamental transformation of the industrial base.
Romano had entered the facility expecting exploitation and discovering instead competence. He had anticipated brutal efficiency driven by harsh discipline and found instead systematic effectiveness based on good design and adequate resources. Every day revealed new evidence that American industrial capabilities exceeded Italian equivalents, not by narrow margins, but by multiples that suggested fundamentally different economic realities. Ferrara experienced his own revelations working in quality control. His initial assignment had been to inspect chocolate bars for obvious defects like improper wrapping or visible contamination. But Dorothy, the American supervisor, began training him in more sophisticated assessment methods. She taught him to evaluate chocolate texture by snap test, to identify tempering problems by surface appearance, to detect subtle flavor variations that indicated ingredient quality issues. What struck Ferrara most profoundly was the rejection rate. In Italian factories he had visited before the war, defect rates of 10 or 15% were considered acceptable for mass production. Anything that functioned adequately was passed through because the pressure to maintain output quotas overrode quality concerns. At Sweetwater, the target rejection rate was 2%, and supervisors investigated any increase above that threshold as indicating potential systemic problems requiring correction. During one quality review meeting, Ferrara questioned why such stringent standards were maintained for a product as simple as candy bars. Dorothy's response challenged his assumptions about manufacturing philosophy. Quality is not about the importance of the product, it is about the integrity of the process. If we accept poor quality in candy production, we train workers to accept poor quality in all production. When those workers move to aircraft factories or munitions plants, they carry those habits with them. American manufacturing maintains high-quality standards across all products because quality is a cultural value, not a cost-benefit calculation for specific items. She showed him production data from other American industries. Aircraft manufacturers maintain defect rates below 1%. Ammunition plants tested every 10th round for specification compliance. Even simple products like military uniforms were inspected to standards that would have seemed excessive in European production. The consistency of quality emphasis across different industries suggested systematic commitment rather than product-specific requirements.
Ferrara found himself gradually shifting from cynical compliance to genuine engagement with the quality control process. He began identifying subtle defects that American workers missed, not because they were incompetent, but because his European background gave him different perspectives on potential failure modes. His suggestions for inspection improvements were not dismissed or ignored, but actually implemented when they proved effective. For the first time since his capture, Ferrara felt his expertise was valued rather than merely exploited. Bianchi's experience on the packaging line provided yet another perspective on American industrial operations. The packaging equipment operated at speeds that required constant attention and quick reflexes to maintain production flow. But unlike the exhausting manual labor he had expected, the work was more mentally demanding than physically brutal. The machines did the heavy lifting, while workers monitored operation, cleared minor jams, and ensured proper material feed. What amazed Bianchi was the maintenance schedule. Every Sunday, the entire facility shut down for equipment maintenance and deep cleaning. Technicians systematically inspected every machine, replaced worn components before they failed, and addressed any performance degradation detected during the previous week's operation. This preventative maintenance philosophy seemed wasteful to Bianchi, who had been trained to run equipment until it broke and only then address problems. But he gradually recognized that the American approach actually maximized productivity. By preventing failures through systematic maintenance, the facility avoided the catastrophic breakdowns that had plagued Italian factories where equipment ran until complete failure forced extended shutdowns for emergency repairs. The Americans lost a few hours each week to planned maintenance but gained consistent operation the rest of the time. Italian factories lost no time to planned maintenance but suffered random extended shutdowns that more than offset the apparent efficiency gain. During a lunch break, Bianchi shared these observations with an American mechanic named Robert, who worked on the packaging line maintenance crew. The young Italian expressed confusion about why such elaborate maintenance was performed on equipment that produced mere candy. Robert's response revealed assumptions Bianchi had never considered. We maintain this equipment properly because it belongs to someone who values it.
The company that owns this machinery invested substantial capital in purchasing and installing it. They want that investment to last and remain productive for decades. Poor maintenance would destroy asset value and make the company less competitive. So we maintain everything properly, regardless of what it produces. Equipment that makes candy today might be retooled to make something else tomorrow. The maintenance habits remain constant across different applications. This explanation highlighted a fundamental difference between American and Italian industrial cultures. Italian factories operated with the assumption that equipment was essentially disposable, to be used intensively until failure and then replaced when necessary. American facilities treated equipment as long-term capital assets, requiring preservation and care. The difference seemed subtle, but had enormous implications for productivity, reliability, and industrial capacity over time. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the Italian prisoners at Sweetwater had settled into a routine that bore little resemblance to their expectations of captivity. They worked regular shifts in clean conditions, received adequate food, including occasional access to products they helped manufacture, lived in barracks that exceeded minimum standards for prisoner housing, and interacted daily with American workers who treated them as colleagues rather than enemies or slaves. The psychological adjustment was profound and disorienting. These men had been soldiers in an army that promoted martial values, glorified sacrifice, and treated comfort as weakness. They had been raised in a society that emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and submission to authority. They had been taught that suffering built character and that luxury corrupted the soul. And now they found themselves in an environment where efficiency was valued over suffering, where quality of life was considered important rather than frivolous, where workers were treated as valuable resources rather than disposable labor. Romano found himself in a conversation with Major Patterson during a production planning review that exposed these tensions.
The Italian sergeant had prepared a proposal for optimizing ingredient inventory flows to reduce storage requirements and improve production scheduling efficiency. Patterson reviewed the proposal with interest and approved implementation with minor modifications. As they concluded the meeting, Patterson made an observation that crystallized the cultural differences at play. "Sergeant Romano, you have adapted well to our operational methods and made valuable contributions to facility efficiency. I have noticed, however, that you and your fellow prisoners often seem uncomfortable with how we operate here. You work diligently, but with an underlying tension, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. May I ask what causes this discomfort?" Romano considered how to articulate feelings he had not fully processed himself. "Major, we were taught that American wealth was built on exploitation, that your industrial power came from extracting resources from conquered peoples and subjugated workers. We expected to find that exploitation directed at us, as prisoners. Instead, we find competence, efficiency, and treatment that exceeds what our own army provided to its soldiers. This contradiction creates cognitive dissonance we struggle to resolve." Patterson nodded understanding. "You were told that prosperity requires someone to suffer, that abundance for some necessitates deprivation for others. You believe that American industrial capacity must therefore rest on hidden exploitation. But what if that assumption is fundamentally wrong? What if prosperity can be created through productivity rather than extraction, through efficiency rather than oppression?" He gestured around the facility visible through the office windows. "Everything you see here was built through productivity gains, technological innovation, and systematic organization. We do not need to exploit workers because we have machines that multiply labor effectiveness. We do not need to extract resources from conquered territories because our own continent provides abundant raw materials. We do not need authoritarian discipline because workers who are treated well and trained properly perform better than workers who are driven by fear." This explanation challenged premises so fundamental to Romano's worldview that accepting it required reconstructing his entire understanding of economics, politics, and social organization. If Patterson was correct, then much of what Romano had believed about the nature of power and prosperity was simply wrong. The implications extended far beyond confectionery production to question the entire ideological framework that had justified fascism, militarism, and the war that had brought him to this place.
As the summer progressed, the facility received new equipment that demonstrated the continuous improvement characteristic of American industrial operations. A new wrapping machine arrived that could package chocolate bars at twice the speed of existing equipment while using less material and producing more consistent seal quality. The installation required only 2 days, after which operators received training on the new system and production rates increased accordingly. Ferreira watched the installation with professional fascination. In Italy, such equipment would have been a major capital investment, requiring months of planning, installation, and debugging. Here, it arrived on a Tuesday, was operational by Thursday, and was producing at full capacity the following Monday. The casual efficiency of the process revealed industrial capabilities that extended beyond any single facility, to encompass entire supply chains, training systems, and technical support networks. What perhaps had the most lasting impact on the Italian prisoners was not the industrial capabilities they observed, but the social attitudes they encountered. American workers at the facility treated the prisoners not as defeated enemies to be despised, but as fellow workers who happened to be on the wrong side of a war. There was no cruelty, no deliberate humiliation, no attempt to break their spirits or extract submission through degradation. Dorothy invited Ferreira to her family home for Sunday dinner, an act of hospitality that would have been unthinkable in the rigid social hierarchies of fascist Italy. The American mechanic, Robert, spent lunch breaks teaching Bianchi about automotive engines and American baseball, sharing interests across enemy lines as if the war was simply an unfortunate circumstance rather than an all-consuming ideological struggle. Morrison discussed production management techniques with Romano as professional equals, valuing his input and acknowledging his expertise despite his status as a prisoner. These interactions gradually eroded the dehumanizing narratives that had made warfare possible. It was difficult to maintain hatred for enemies who treated you with respect. It was hard to believe in inherent American decadence when surrounded by evidence of competence and discipline.
It became impossible to sustain the ideological certainties that had justified the war when daily experience contradicted every propaganda claim about American weakness, disorganization, and moral corruption. By autumn of 1944, the Italian prisoners at Sweetwater had become integrated into the facility's operations to a degree that would have seemed impossible during their first shocked days of arrival. They understood the production processes, contributed to efficiency improvements, maintained quality standards, and worked alongside American civilians with the easy cooperation of experienced colleagues. The psychological transformation was complete, even if the war that had made them prisoners continued in Europe and the Pacific. Romano sat in the facility cafeteria one evening in October, sharing coffee with Morrison and discussing production planning for the upcoming holiday season when military demand for confectionery products traditionally spiked. The conversation was technical, professional, and unmarked by any acknowledgement of their nominal status as captor and captive. In that moment, Romano realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world and his place in it. He had entered this facility expecting exploitation and found respect. He had anticipated crude efficiency and discovered sophisticated competence. He had assumed American industrial power was somehow illegitimate or temporary, and learned instead that it rested on systematic advantages accumulated over generations of development. Most profoundly, he had believed that different nations and peoples were locked in zero-sum competition where one side's gain required another's loss, and he was beginning to suspect that this belief was the true lie at the heart of the ideology that had led Italy into disastrous war. The education was complete, though the war that had necessitated it continued. The confident Italian soldiers who had dismissed America as decadent and weak had discovered an industrial civilization that operated according to principles they had never encountered and barely understood. Their assumptions had been systematically dismantled, not through propaganda or coercion, but through daily exposure to realities that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. The revolution in understanding was written not in dramatic revelations, but in the accumulation of countless small observations that collectively revealed a truth the prisoners had been trained to deny. American power was real, systematic, and built on foundations that made it sustainable rather than temporary. The abundance was not stolen but created. The efficiency was not cruel but productive. The respect for workers was not weakness but strength. In the end, the Italian prisoners at Sweetwater learned what German pilots had learned in the skies over Italy, what Japanese soldiers would learn on Pacific Islands, what every Axis nation would ultimately discover through defeat. American industrial and military capabilities were not propaganda or illusion. They were real, they were vast, and they reflected systematic advantages that ideology could not overcome and propaganda could not explain away. The education was complete, though the cost of learning had been measured in years of life lost to captivity and nations destroyed by wars they could never have won.